So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to an interview with Lawrence Hill, the author of the Book of Negroes. And I'll show you my hard copy here of the Book of Negroes and say, welcome, Lawrence. And
Thank you.
I hope that we can have just a wonderful conversation for however long you would like it to be around your book and around the whole connection to Emancipation and Emancipation Day. So, yes, we know you as the author of the book, but before we delve into the book, please tell us about yourself, tell us about your family, and your connection to today's uh, present day's emancipation events.
Well, thank you, Donna. It's really lovely to join you today. Well, my name is Lawrence Hill, but friends and family members call me Larry, so feel free to do that too if you'd like to. I'm a Black Canadian. I'm a writer.
Thank you.
I grew up in Toronto, lived all over the world, including in various countries in West Africa, but I live now in Hamilton, Ontario. Have a wife and 5 children. Carolyn, whom you've seen, is the second of 5. Um, my parents came to Canada the day after they married interracially in Washington, D.C., on the Howard University campus in 1953. My father was an African American who had been a soldier for the American forces in the Second World War, and he was deeply embittered by having been shown and told that he was certainly good enough to die for his country at war, but not good enough to live in a integrated environment in his own country or to have access to all the jobs that other Americans would have access to, not to mention places to live and social mobility and everything else. And so after the war, Second World War, he decided that he would leave the United States and go somewhere where he felt he could live more freely. And so he did an MA at the University of Toronto, went back to teach for 1 year in Washington, met my mother, who was a white civil rights activist named Donna Hill, who grew up in the most conservative and white family imaginable in the United States. But somehow she escaped the clutches of that particular political ideology and became a very active civil rights activist in the United States before meeting my father. And then together, they fell in love and moved to Toronto the day after they married in 1953. And so my parents spent their lives at the forefront of the human rights movement in Canada. They co-founded the Ontario Black History Society. My father was the first director and later chairperson of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. He wrote a marvelously popular book, a book that he was very proud of because it was the first popular history of Black people in Canada, as opposed to, say, an academic or a theoretical history. It was called The Freedom Seekers, Blacks in Early Canada, and it remained in print for a good 20 years. He was very proud of having written that book, which sprang from his work, his PhD dissertation at the University of Toronto. Um, and he later on became Ombudsman of Ontario. And again, my mother was fighting the civil rights fight in Ontario in the 1950s, long before it was a popular thing to do, and long before my father got actively involved, because at the time he was still studying. So really, they had a long, loving relationship with each other and with me, but also very engaged in the Black and the civil rights movements, on both sides of the border, but most especially in Canada. So that's a bit about my background.
Thank you. Um, for the people who are unfamiliar with the Book of Negroes, and for those hesitant about sort of reading in the name of protecting their peace from trauma porn, what would you say makes makes this an important read for those people.
Oh, thank you, Donna. Well, first of all, I don't think that anybody should read anything that they don't feel ready to read or don't want to read. And that includes my books. I mean, you may not be in a space psychologically, psychiatrically, just in terms of your overall well-being. You may not be in a place where you're willing to take on, a demanding book that has a fair bit of tragedy and pain in it. And that's okay. So really that's my first answer. Nothing compels a reader to go someplace where they can't go. Just like if there's a movie that's supposed to be great, but that's also very violent, maybe you just don't feel like seeing that really great violent movie because you just don't feel you up to that. And that's okay too. That's happened to me many times where I say I haven't gone to see movies that everybody says are great just because I wasn't ready for the bloodbath that was surely going to happen in that movie. The
Yeah.
Book of Negroes is a novel, is my seventh book. I've now written, well, 11 if you can count the one that's about to be published in January. And it was my third novel, and it's a novel that takes the form of a slave narrative. So it pretends to be an autobiographical account of a Black woman who moves really around the world in a sort of an intercontinental milk run from her time of birth in the 1700s in Mali, a landlocked country in West Africa, to her enslavement and abduction and movement through the Middle Passage into slavery and off the coast of South Carolina, and then up to New York City during the American Revolutionary War. And then she comes with the Black loyalists from New York City to Nova Scotia, and that doesn't work out. And so near the end of her life, she goes back to Africa, as other African Canadians did, seeking, the permanency of freedom in their homeland. And so she goes back to Africa, and from there launches a fight to bring about the abolition of the British slave trade. So it's a it's a novel that follows a woman's life from childhood to just before her death, um, acting as a slave narrative, an autobiographical account. And because I've always felt that those slave narratives were very powerful, and it really attempts to show the resilience and the strength and the depth and the courage and the heart and the individuality, the love of a woman, in this time. I think that often slavery tends to put a mask over people, and you use the word slave or slavery, and suddenly you don't see a human being. You don't imagine a person with hands or a face or physical gestures or skills or a lover or children. You just imagine a person who is faceless. And that's what the word slave often does. And I wanted to sort of take the mask off that whole notion of slavery and show that this is a woman who has a life, a deep, rich life full of love. Yes, full of much struggle and tragedy and pain and loss, but also full of love and ambition and courage and resilience. And so I wanted to individualize this experience, because that's, of course, what novelists do. They go into the personal in order to sort of speak to the universal. So that's a little bit about the Book of Negroes. So it's set over the course of this woman's life, Aminata Diallo, from her time of birth in the mid 1700s to just before she dies in the early 1800s.
Gotcha. Thank you. So, how does the history in this book connect to present day and our thoughts and our events around emancipation?
How does the history of this book connect to present day issues and our thoughts about emancipation? Well, of course, this is a novel about a woman who is born free. She's a freeborn Muslim girl in Mali, a landlocked country in West Africa, at her birth around 1745. And she's learning to read and write, at the hands of her father in Mali, before read and write in Arabic, which is the language of the Quran, before she's abducted and brought into slavery into the New World. And of course, the transatlantic slave trade, thankfully, has ended, but forms of gross and heinous oppression continue to this day. We can talk about the Holocaust. We can talk about the internment of Japanese Canadians. We can talk about the brutal civil war in the former Yugoslavia or the genocide in Rwanda. But specifically, as it relates to African Canadians, say, in African peoples of African descent in the Americas, in the New World, let's say. Um, we have a long way to go in terms of achieving peace and freedom and equality and absence of violence and opportunities for our children and ourselves that equal those of other people in this in say in Canada, if we're talking about Canada. And I think there's another point to be made as well, and that is that although the transatlantic slave trade has ended, there is a form of contemporary slavery that exists today in which millions and millions of people are in conditions that can only be likened to slavery. They are primarily sex slaves, primarily girls and women who are brought forcefully into forced sexual servitude. And this is well documented by experts throughout Canada, the United States, the UK. And to anybody who tells me that slavery is over, so why worry about it? I would say, well, we need to sort of wake up and realize that millions of people around this world continue to be kept in conditions of heinous oppression and slavery. And it's a different form of slavery that existed in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, but it exists still. And so we have a moral obligation to be aware of what's going on in our world and to stand up against all forms of human oppression. And so, although Aminata's particular situation has evolved since the time that she was living in the 1700s. Issues of social justice and racial oppression continue very profoundly to this day. And I think that's why we're meeting here now.
Gotcha. What um what do you think change will look like for us in Canada in terms of that oppression? In your view, what do you think it would look like?
What will change look like in terms of racial oppression in Canada? Well, um, to those who like to say naively, I'm showing my cards here. Naively, I say that we are in a post-racial world. I think it's really the most ridiculous and naive term imaginable. What is post-racial about a world that continues to oppress Black people and others? Let's talk about Indigenous people too, for example. Um, and so we're not in a post-racial world. We're in a world, sadly, in which racial identity matters very profoundly. All you have to do is look at the populations of prisons in this country and see who's incarcerated and who is not, and the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people, including Black and Indigenous women in Canada's penitentiaries, to see that there is still monumental injustice, at play in this country. So yes, we're making progress, which is great, but I think it's often a case of 3 steps forward, 4 steps back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, maybe 4 steps forward. And so it's an inching, halting, difficult, challenging progress. And we can never rest easy. I don't think our children or grandchildren will be able to rest easy either, because I think that every generation will have the obligation to face injustice and oppression in its own time. The face of injustice and oppression will change, but injustice, I do believe, will continue to reproduce itself in various formats, because human evil and human advantage and human hierarchy, I think, will always be around and with us and plaguing us. So, but as for how things look, I think that we have to put pressure on, and we are, and will continue to. We say in the Black community, but other people in other communities too have to put pressure on our leaders, whether they're business or academic or in the arts or in government, to institute changes, permanent, deep-seated, systemic changes that will allow for um, greater equality in this country. And of course, that permeates every sector of our nation, from decisions about hiring, training, promotion, recruitment, education, um, quite apart from overt discriminatory actions. I think that one of the most pernicious and painful and damaging things that can happen to a child in the educational system is a subtle thing, which is to be underestimated and not to have a child's abilities and intelligence welcomed and encouraged and nourished, but to just say that child's never going to go anywhere, just forget them. I think that's actually one of the most damaging things you can do to a child and to their future and to their families, and that has to stop. And Black children, have to be encouraged and supported and nourished like other children, throughout all of our educational systems, including post-secondary. I must say that because
Absolutely.
I'm a professor at the University of Guelph, and injustice, plays out at the post-secondary level too.
Absolutely. So the leaders of our country are supposed to lead us. So what would you say to our leaders about getting to that change? What would you um, advise them or direct them to do in their positions as leaders of this country?
Well, for one thing, put your money where your mouth is. It's one thing to issue platitudes about we should all live in diversity and harmony, but those words get really tired when they're not backed up with actions. Um, there are many, many people in desperate need of housing, in desperate need of economic support. If you know anybody who happens to be on social assistance, you'll know how incredibly difficult it is for a person on social assistance to live a decent life in, say, a city such as Toronto, where I grew up, and I still live near Toronto in the city of Hamilton. Same thing in Hamilton, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say public housing, um, economic supports for people who are down and out on their luck, more investment, in education, more political representation of Black people and others in the halls of power in this country, um, including, of course, in our police forces and in our university leaderships. Um, it is not a guarantee of equality that we'll have a few faces here and there, in government or in positions of leadership in the academic or private sectors. But it's a start, and it's part of a movement. And of course, the people who are put in positions of power there have to be engaged with issues of social justice. So it's not just good enough to put or to encourage a Black person to come forward for these positions, but hopefully there will be people who care about issues of social justice and are deeply invested in advancing those interests. So I would say put your money where your mouth is and invest in first and foremost in anti-poverty approaches and in education.
Is there one thing as we look at Emancipation Day and the events, is there one thing for us to think about and to take away from the events and that whole idea of emancipation in our modern day life?
Well, thank you. That's a very complex question, and there's so many ways to get at the notion of emancipation. What does emancipation really mean? Emancipation, of course, means freedom. Emancipation Day refers to the abolition of slavery in most of the British Empire on August 1st, 1834. And we celebrate, of course, the abolition of slavery, even though we recognize that forms of racial and social injustice continue very much to this day. But emancipation and freedom mean much more than the abolition of of, of slavery in 1834. They also refer to, in a more metaphorical way, possibilities of freedom. And what does freedom mean? Freedom can also be the freedom of your own mind. I was just reading the other day about Marcus Garvey again. Of course, I've read about Marcus Garvey many times over my life, but just the other day, as I'm helping to write the screenplay for a new TV miniseries, I happened to be reading about Marcus Garvey again. And of course, he talked about the emancipation of the mind. And now, in order to be truly free, you had to be emancipated in your own mind. And I guess, in one way, I would say that emancipation can be having the freedom, the courage in your own mind to pursue as vigorously as you can, with all the barriers in front of you, the dreams that you have, and not to let go of those dreams. And pursuing dreams isn't just about fame or fortune or having a job that looks good on paper. I mean, it
Mhm.
could be that your dream is to be a volunteer in your church down the street because you get great pleasure from baking for that church sale, or it could be that you're a soccer coach and you really love to coach kids to teach them how to play soccer better, and that gives you great pleasure in life, while your work is something else. And so emancipation and freedom, I think, on a larger sense, mean having the courage and the guts, and the perseverance to go after the things that you really want to do in your life. You only get to live once, and you should really make the most of it as much as you can. And we all face barriers, and they're very monumental at times, but still we have to do our best to carve out the kind of living that we want. And I know from my own personal life, and I've always tried to tell my children, all five of them, that life looks a lot better and your own sense of emancipation is that much greater when you're living the way you want to live, and you're at least going after the things that make you excited and passionate and happy. And that, of course, can take every form imaginable. But
Mhm.
emancipation, in addition to the personal sense of freedom and the pursuit of one's passion, to the legal sense of emancipation, also refers to freedom to live in dignity and as an equal and respected Canadian, since we're talking about Canada.
Mhm.
And so it means, having the freedom to live without having the the tent ripped out from over your head because you have no other place to live but a tent, in a park because you happen to be without a home right now. It could be the freedom to find a way to go to pursue post secondary education, even though you have no money and very few opportunities, but you would really like to learn to become that carpenter, but you just, haven't had a chance to go at that because you're so strapped for money. And so emancipation, I think, in its broadest sense, also refers to societal, not just equality, but to help finding ways for those of us who have resources and are in power and can change the way our country moves, to support those who have less, who would like to pursue their dreams too. And that's also a form of social emancipation. So I guess for me, Emancipation Day refers to all of those things. And I'm sorry for the long-winded answer,
Absolutely.
but
Not
emancipation,
long-winded. It was great.
it's a big word and it deserves a big answer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's go back to something you mentioned before. You said you have a new book that is going to be published soon. My question was going to be, do you have a modern day version of the Book of Negroes that you are planning to write or have written?
Well, thank you, Donna. That's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not writing a sequel to the Book of Negroes, if that's what you're asking, but what would a modern day version be? I mean, I guess the answer has to be a modern day version would be just to choose, as I do and as I have in books that I've written since the Book of Negroes and books that I hope to continue to write in the future, would be really any book that explores human courage and human resilience in a modern day context. Uh, I mean, one of the lines in the Book of Negroes is Daddy Moses, who's a black church minister in Nova Scotia,
Mhm.
says to his people, "We are traveling peoples," and of course we are. Sometimes our travels as black people have been involuntary and forced, and other times they've been free and they've been self-propelled. But we are traveling peoples, and we move all around this planet. And I've always been very interested in the interconnections between people who are black, who hail from different parts of the world. And it's not as if there's black Canadian culture and history, and then African American Canadian culture, and then in Jamaica and in the UK. No, I think they're all interconnected, profoundly interconnected. Why? Because we move around and we are those people who inhabit often all of those places in our lifetime, or our ancestors have, and we are. And so we're connected in many ways. So um, when I write, I just look to excite my readers often about some aspect of Canadian history that is also Black history, that is little known, that involves intersections with other countries. Could be the United States, it could be Jamaica, it could be the UK, it could be various African countries. And I'm interested in exploring little known elements of Black history and Black life in this country that are ripe for the picking in terms of dramatizing it as a novelist. So that's my goal and pleasure. And whether it's a novel set today or yesterday or tomorrow, I think that there's always a challenge to sort of draw a bold and striking canvas that sort of illuminates the experiences of African Canadians.
And where can our viewers find your books, Larry?
Oh, well, my books, they can be found in libraries, and believe me, I've borrowed library books 1,000 times in my life, certainly throughout my childhood and adolescence, absolutely. So my books are found in public libraries, and they're found in almost all bookstores. And of course, the great thing about a good bookstore, any good bookstore, is that you can go in, and if they don't have the book you want, you can ask for it and they'll bring it in for you. And so it's any bookstore, whether it's online or in person, would either have the books that I've written or would be able to order them in.
I thank you very, very much for this conversation and hope we are able to talk again soon. Thank you for spending the time with us.
Thank you very much, Don. It's my great pleasure too. I wish you all the best and a rich and happy and healthy Emancipation Day. And I really look forward to having the pleasure of meeting you in person one day soon. All the best to you and your family and friends.
Thank you very much.
All
Thank you,
right.
Carolyn.